The city felt wired, like a live wire humming beneath the marble. TV trucks idled along Constitution Avenue, their masts stabbing the wet evening air. Inside the Capitol Visitor Center, ushers whispered, camera lenses glinted, and a curated audience waited for a soft landing speech the press had already labeled a healing moment. Jill Biden stepped to the lectern with measured grace, ivory suit, steady smile, the practiced composure of someone who understands the power of tone. Our country, she began, needs mercy more than victory, conversation more than combat. The words floated, polished, almost musical. Heads nodded, phones rose. The hashtag wrote itself. From 3 rows back, Senator John Kennedy watched without blinking. Elbows on the armrests, papers folded once and squared, he looked less like a guest and more like the counterargument waiting to happen. His mind ticked through a ledger the speech wouldn't touch, grocery prices that made parents do math in the cereal aisle, police departments stretched to threadbare, border towns carrying a weight they didn't vote for. He respected civility, he distrusted sedation. Leadership, in his book, wasn't mood lighting, it was switch flipping. Make it safer, cheaper, saner. Period. Jill's cadence rose. We heal when we listen, we grow when we forgive. The audience broke into gentle applause, warm and well-mannered. Kennedy half-smiled the way a fisherman does when the cork dips but doesn't disappear. He glanced toward the back cameras, then toward the press row, and finally at the clock glowing amber on the wall. Timing, like policy, either works or it doesn't. She pivoted to a story about a teacher in Scranton buying supplies out of pocket. It landed. But as the applause swelled again, Kennedy stood, unhurried, polite, and the room's oxygen shifted. He didn't take the lectern, he didn't need to, his drawl carried like gravel across water. "Ma'am," he said, hands open, voice calm as a courthouse porch, "America does need kindness. But she also needs electricity that stays on, streets where kids can ride a bike after supper, and a border that doesn't look like a suggestion." A ripple moved through the rows, surprise, curiosity, a flicker of disapproval, and then a hush, the expensive kind. Jill's smile tightened by a millimeter, the cameras loved it. Kennedy continued, still courteous. "Words can soothe, Dr. Biden. But a country can't eat them." Gasps, a quick cough of laughter, a clipped shoo from the aisle. The moderator shifted in his seat, deciding whether to intervene and deciding, for now, not to. Jill placed both hands on the lectern, steady as a metronome. "Senator," she said evenly, "compassion isn't the opposite of strength." Kennedy nodded once, as if invited. "No, ma'am. But it's not a substitute for it, either." And with that, the evening stopped being a program, and became a contest. The silence that followed was not ordinary. It was the kind that stretches a heartbeat into a full minute. A few in the audience shifted in their seats, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply hold their breath. The stage lights, designed to flatter, now seemed too bright, catching the faintest twitch of tension in Jill Biden's jaw. She smoothed her notes, but her eyes stayed fixed on Kennedy, as though willing him back into his chair. But Kennedy wasn't moving. His presence, planted and deliberate, made clear this was no interruption, it was an intervention. "Senator," Jill said again, this time her voice carrying more steel. "The role of a First Lady is not to legislate policy but to uplift the spirit of the nation. That's what I'm doing here tonight." Applause broke out from her allies in the front rows, eager to reset the rhythm. But Kennedy didn't blink. He raised his hand, palm outward, not to silence her but to signal respect before he spoke again. "Ma'am, with all due regard, uplifting spirit doesn't put supper on the table. It doesn't lower crime, and it doesn't pay the gas bill. The American people are already inspired. They're just tired of being broke." The jab landed harder than a punch. The moderator fumbled with his papers, muttering about keeping decorum, but the cameras had already locked on. Jill, determined not to let him seize the narrative, leaned forward. "Do you believe anger will fix those problems, Senator?" Do you think belittling compassion brings Americans together? Kennedy's eyes narrowed slightly, his drawl sharpening like a file across metal. No, ma'am. I think results bring Americans together. A working family in Louisiana doesn't care about the poetry of unity if they can't afford eggs. And forgive me, but speeches about healing sound a lot like telling them to smile through the pain. Gasps, murmurs, even a sharp, "That's unfair," from the balcony. But a pocket of applause, raw, unscripted, erupted from the back rows, ordinary citizens who hadn't been invited to nod politely but had come to be heard. Kennedy gestured toward them. That's not me talking. That's them. The cameras caught Jill's expression, unflinching, yes, but no longer serene. This was no longer a ceremony. It had become a duel of philosophies, played out in real time before millions. Kennedy finally eased back into his chair, not in retreat but in challenge, as if to say, "Your move." Jill adjusted the microphone, her voice calm but edged now with urgency. Leadership, Senator, is not just about fixing what's broken. It's about reminding people why it's worth fixing at all. The crowd hummed with divided energy, half uplifted, half unconvinced. And somewhere between those halves, the stage had become a battlefield. The air in the hall had shifted. What had begun as a ceremonial platform for unity had now morphed into something sharper, more combustible. Journalists in the front rows leaned forward, pens scratching frantically, while the television crews adjusted their lenses to catch every flicker of emotion. Jill Biden, still poised, exhaled slowly before responding. She knew the power of optics. If she appeared rattled, Kennedy would have already won the night. But if she projected calm resilience, the narrative could swing back. "Senator," she began, her voice softened to a near whisper, forcing the room to lean in. "Do you think dismissing empathy makes you stronger? Families don't just need checks in the mail, they need hope, too. Without it, there's nothing to fight for." Her words landed not as a counterpunch but as a plea. For a moment, even some of Kennedy's supporters fell quiet, caught between admiration for his bluntness and recognition of her conviction. Kennedy tilted his head, that familiar wry smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am, I respect your heart. But hope without solutions is just a Hallmark card. You can't feed your children with optimism. And you can't build trust in government by offering platitudes while the border is leaking, the economy is sagging, and crime is climbing." The drawl lingered, cutting like gravel dragged across glass. He wasn't speaking in abstracts, he was drawing a map of frustration etched into kitchen tables and late-night bills across the nation. A ripple ran through the crowd. One half stirred with applause, the other bristled with indignation. Jill tightened her grip on the lectern, the paper beneath her fingers trembling slightly. She raised her chin. "You think I don't see those struggles? I live in this country too, but leadership is about uniting, not dividing. If all we do is trade blows, who carries the burden? The people, always the people." The tension was thick enough to taste. Kennedy leaned forward, resting one elbow on his chair's arm, eyes locked on her like a marksman sighting in. "That's exactly my point, ma'am. The people are carrying the burden. And they're tired of it. What they want isn't another speech about togetherness, they want someone to take the weight off their backs." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "That starts with honesty. Not poetry." The crowd broke, no longer in polite halves but in full-throated camps. Shouts of "That's right," clashed with cries of "Shame." The moderator's gavel tapped uselessly against the table. For the first time, the First Lady and the Senator weren't just debating, they were embodying two Americas colliding, live and unfiltered, in front of the world. The room was now a live wire, every eye darting between Jill Biden and Senator Kennedy as if waiting for one of them to finally break. The moderator, beads of sweat glistening under the stage lights, attempted once again to restore order, but the gavel's faint echo was swallowed by the roar of clashing voices. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a battle for the soul of the moment, and both speakers knew the cameras were devouring every second. Jill straightened, pulling the microphone a little closer. Her voice carried the weight of controlled fire. "Senator Kennedy, you stand there with your rehearsed lines about burden and honesty, but let's be clear, your rhetoric isn't about lifting people up. It's about sowing division. That's not leadership, that's opportunism." She let the word opportunism hang in the air like smoke after a gunshot. A section of the audience erupted in cheers, their claps sharp and defiant. Kennedy didn't flinch. He leaned back, his hand tapping the table rhythmically as if counting down before delivering the blow. "Ma'am, if pointing out the failures of leadership is division, then maybe unity has been redefined to mean silence. And I'm not here to be silent. I'm here to speak for folks who don't get invited to these polished events, who don't sit on panels, who can't afford lobbyists to carry their message. Those are the people I answer to, not the political class that claps for pretty speeches." The crowd roared again, this time, louder than before. A chant broke out in the back rows, swelling like a wave. Kennedy paused to let it ride, a showman's instinct fused with a trial lawyer's patience. Jill, unwilling to lose ground, raised her palm to quiet her own supporters, then fixed her gaze on him with surgical precision. "You talk about the people, Senator. But real leadership means telling them hard truths, not just what makes them clap. Yes, times are difficult. Yes, the country feels divided. But when you pour fuel on fear, when you mock attempts at unity, you don't solve problems, you deepen wounds." Kennedy's eyes narrowed, his tone shifting lower, almost conspiratorial. "And when you keep pretending everything is fine, when you tell folks to just hold on while their lives crumble, you're not healing wounds, you're ignoring them. And people know the difference, ma'am. They can smell spin before the words even leave a politician's lips." A tense silence followed, heavier than the shouting before. It was as though both had dragged the nation's raw nerve into the open, and now the entire hall was holding its breath to see which voice history would remember louder. The silence didn't last long. It fractured under the pressure of murmurs, whispers, and then a sudden eruption of clapping that rolled like thunder across the hall. Half the audience leaned toward Jill Biden, admiring her composure. The other half leaned toward Kennedy, electrified by his raw defiance. It was no longer a polite debate, it was a duel, and both contenders understood that this moment would echo far beyond the stage. Jill steadied herself, her posture regal, her voice sharpened like a blade. "Senator, you accuse me of pretending everything is fine, but let's be honest, you thrive on exaggeration. You weaponize hardship, paint America as a failing nation, because it gives you power. That's not courage, that's performance. People need solutions, not sound bites." She raised her chin slightly, her tone rising in confidence. "America doesn't move forward when its leaders dwell in despair. It moves forward when leaders inspire hope." The applause from her side surged. For a moment, she seemed to regain the upper hand. But Kennedy was a man built for these collisions, and he let her finish without interruption. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he leaned into the microphone, his southern drawl carrying a weight that silenced even his loudest critics. "Ma'am, hope is a beautiful thing. But hope without honesty is nothing more than a bedtime story you tell kids so they'll sleep through the storm. Folks aren't children. They know when their wallets are empty. They know when their streets aren't safe. They know when the people in charge are living in a different America than they are. And no matter how many speeches you give about moving forward, they're stuck standing still." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few voices shouted in protest, but many others erupted in chants, Kennedy's name rising above the noise. Jill didn't flinch, her smile was tight, her grip firm on the podium. She let the noise swirl, then struck back with precision. "And yet, Senator, here you are, standing on this stage, benefiting from the very system you claim is broken. You criticize, but you don't fix. You mock leaders, but you don't lead. Leadership is not about burning down the house to prove there's a fire. It's about putting it out." The hall went wild, cheers clashing with boos, the atmosphere on the edge of chaos. Kennedy raised one hand, motioning for calm, then delivered the line that would make headlines. "Lady, if the house is burning, the first job is to admit it's on fire. Only then can you put it out. Pretending the smoke is just a little fog doesn't save anybody, it kills them. And the people out there, they're tired of choking on fog that comes from Washington." The chamber erupted again, but this time, it wasn't divided. It was explosive, because both sides knew they had just witnessed a turning point. The air was thick, part theater, part battleground. The moderator tried to speak, but his voice was drowned in the waves of shouting, chanting, and clapping. The debate had spiraled beyond polite exchanges. It was raw, almost primal, the kind of clash that left history books inked with fire. Jill Biden adjusted the microphone, her voice cutting through like a polished knife. "Senator, this is not a courtroom drama. This is America's future. You play to the cameras, but the real work, the heavy lifting, doesn't happen in moments like this. It happens in schools, in hospitals, in the quiet places where families fight to get by. You don't walk with them, Senator, you grandstand." Her words dripped with accusation, each syllable aimed at Kennedy like arrows. "You don't want to build bridges, you want to burn them and then stand in the ashes, pretending you've solved something." The crowd roared in approval, a swelling wave of cheers that nearly shook the stage. Jill turned slightly, her smile widening, victorious for a fleeting moment. But Kennedy didn't retreat. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and then he leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium so firmly his knuckles went white. "Mrs. Biden, you call it grandstanding. I call it telling the truth. You say the heavy lifting happens quietly. Well, that's the problem. Too much gets buried in the quiet. Too many failures get hidden in whispers. You say I don't walk with people? Lady, I don't just walk with them, I live where they live, I eat what they eat, I hear them every single day. And let me tell you, they're sick and tired of being told they should clap for hope when their fridge is empty and their streets are crumbling." The eruption was volcanic. Chants of "Kennedy! Kennedy!" shook the chamber. Jill, refusing to flinch, straightened herself, eyes blazing. She let him have his moment, then countered with fire of her own. "And yet, Senator, when it comes time to deliver, to write the laws, to push real reform, you vanish. You talk tough here, but where are the bills? Where are the policies? You can point fingers all day long, but until you roll up your sleeves and deliver results, you're just another voice adding to the noise." It was brutal. The audience split into two armies, clashing with applause, jeers, and chants. Even the cameras shook slightly as photographers scrambled closer, capturing every sharp expression, every word flung like a weapon. Kennedy paused, then smiled faintly, shaking his head with mock disbelief. "Ma'am, you want to see results? Look at the people cheering right now. Look at the faces who finally feel like someone's saying out loud what they've been screaming for years. That's leadership, not speeches written by committees, not press releases polished by staffers. Real leadership is truth. And the truth is, your husband's White House doesn't listen. I do." The crowd went wild again, some chanting Jill's name, others Kennedy's. The moderator tried to restore order, but by now, the debate had transformed into something bigger than policy. It was a symbolic collision of two Americas, and neither side was backing down. The tension had reached its boiling point, and Kennedy knew staying behind the podium would cage his words. He stepped out, microphone in hand, walking toward the very edge of the stage. The audience leaned forward, sensing something bigger than policy about to unfold. His voice, calm but thunderous, carried across the chamber without needing amplification. "Folks," he began, scanning the crowd as if every face in the room belonged to someone he personally knew, "politics has turned into a theater where the script is written by elites who never live with the consequences. And tonight, I'm not here to spar with Mrs. Biden, I'm here to speak directly to you." Jill Biden turned sharply, visibly unsettled by his decision to leave the podium. "Senator, this isn't a rally. It's a debate, she shot back, her tone sharp, trying to pull him back into the structured format. Kennedy ignored her, raising his free hand to quiet the noise of the crowd. A debate? He said with a smirk. Ma'am, what we've had for the last 3 years hasn't been a debate, it's been a monologue. One side talks, the other side suffers. I won't play along anymore. The audience erupted, half cheering, half booing. Cameras zoomed in on Kennedy's face, capturing every wrinkle of his intensity. He walked closer to the front row, pointing toward a group of veterans seated near the aisle. These men, he thundered, risked their lives for this country, and when they came home, they got bureaucracy instead of dignity. They got endless forms, long waits, and broken promises. And the First Lady wants to tell me I'm grandstanding? No, ma'am. I'm standing where your husband should have stood, beside them. The roar was deafening. Jill Biden tried to seize back the moment, clutching her microphone with both hands. Senator Kennedy, what you're doing right now is dangerous. You're not informing the public, you're inflaming them. Leadership is about healing, not tearing open wounds. Kennedy turned slowly, fixing his gaze on her. Healing, he repeated, his voice low but cutting like steel. You can't heal what you refuse to diagnose. You don't heal poverty by telling families to hang on while inflation eats them alive. You don't heal broken schools with pretty speeches about resilience. And you sure don't heal a divided nation by lecturing them into silence. The crowd went berserk, many leaping to their feet, clapping and chanting, while Jill stood firm, her face set in defiance. Kennedy raised his microphone higher, his final words of the exchange ringing out like a gavel. You call this dangerous, Mrs. Biden? No. What's dangerous is a government more interested in saving face than saving lives. And I, for one, won't be quiet about it. The chamber shook with noise, and in that moment, the debate had transformed into something beyond politics. It was Kennedy versus the establishment, and every word sent tremors across the nation. Jill Biden refused to be overshadowed. She leaned forward, gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles whitened, and her voice rose above the thunder of the crowd. Senator Kennedy, she said, her words sharp enough to slice through the noise, you confuse spectacle with leadership. You stand here pointing fingers, raising your voice, whipping up anger, but where is your solution? What have you actually done for those veterans you parade as props? The audience gasped. Some booed, others clapped, but everyone was riveted. Kennedy turned his head slowly, his half-smile suggesting he was almost amused. But Jill pressed on, refusing to give him time to cut in. You call my husband's leadership empty words, yet you thrive on outrage without responsibility. You've mastered the art of the soundbite, Senator. You thrive on a divided nation because division makes you louder. That's not bravery, that's exploitation. The sting of her words lingered in the chamber. For a moment, even Kennedy's supporters leaned back, curious to see how he would respond. Jill adjusted the microphone and continued, her tone shifting from confrontational to almost maternal. Americans don't need another voice telling them who to blame. They need someone willing to step up and do the hard work of governing. The president has been doing that every single day while you've been turning hearings into television spectacles. The crowd erupted again, this time split evenly, half cheering her defiance, half shouting in Kennedy's defense. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the moment as Jill Biden, usually the soft-spoken First Lady, unleashed fire against one of the Senate's sharpest tongues. Kennedy tilted his head, letting the noise settle. He finally raised his microphone, his drawl deliberate, almost mocking. Mrs. Biden, he said slowly, I don't need lessons in leadership from someone who got their power by marriage, not merit. The room exploded. Some gasped in outrage, others cheered wildly, as Jill's face flushed with fury. But Kennedy wasn't done. He stepped closer again, pacing deliberately like a prosecutor circling a witness. You ask what I've done for veterans? I've written bills that your husband's administration buried in committee because they didn't fit the narrative. You ask what I've done for working families? I've fought for tax relief while your side raised costs with every bloated spending bill. And as for governing, ma'am, the first rule of governing is to tell the truth. Something this White House has treated like a foreign language. The words landed like blows, each one echoing against Jill Biden's earlier challenge. She clenched her jaw, refusing to look away, but Kennedy had seized the floor again. The crowd roared with chants, the chamber alive with the electricity of two voices clashing not just over policy, but over the soul of American leadership. Jill Biden's face tightened, the sting of Kennedy's jab about power by marriage cutting deeper than she let on. But instead of flinching, she leaned closer to the microphone, her voice rising with a conviction that seemed to draw every pair of eyes in the chamber. You know, Senator, she began, her tone both sharp and steady, it's easy to belittle a woman's role when it doesn't fit your idea of authority. But let's get something straight. I've spent my life in classrooms, teaching children who were forgotten by the very politicians who love to talk about hard work while doing nothing for them. I didn't marry into relevance, I earned it by showing up for the people every single day. The chamber stirred. Even some who leaned conservative paused, taken aback by the sudden force in her words. Jill adjusted her stance, her voice now sharper, almost accusatory. You think shouting in hearings and throwing soundbites on cable news makes you a fighter? That's not courage, Senator, that's theater. And while you're busy playing actor, real families are paying the price for the political games you and your allies keep fueling. She held the silence for a moment, her eyes fixed on Kennedy. Then she delivered her most personal strike yet. You mock me as someone with power by marriage, but I've stood in hospital rooms with grieving military families, I've sat across the table from students who couldn't afford textbooks, I've listened to parents who lost children to gun violence. That's not politics to me, it's reality. Maybe if you spent more time listening to real people instead of rehearsing your next punchline, you'd understand that. The audience gasped, some shouting in support, others hurling insults back at her. Reporters' pens scratched furiously, cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on her face. Jill didn't waver. She raised her chin higher, her voice cutting through the roar. Leadership isn't about tearing people down, Senator. It's about lifting people up, even when it doesn't win you applause, even when it doesn't trend on Twitter. My husband does that every day, and frankly, I would rather stand by a man who acts quietly for the people than a senator who screams loudly for himself. Kennedy smirked, though the jab had landed harder than he let on. He tapped his microphone slowly, waiting for the noise to die down, but Jill's fire had shifted the energy in the room. For the first time, the First Lady wasn't just defending her husband, she was dismantling Kennedy's entire style of politics, piece by piece. The tension reached a boiling point. Kennedy's supporters roared for him to strike back. Jill's defenders shouted for her to continue. The chamber had become a battleground not of policy alone, but of credibility, character, and the very question of what real leadership looked like in America. Senator John Kennedy leaned back in his chair, tapping the microphone with a rhythm that built suspense in the room. His trademark half-smile returned, but this time it wasn't casual, it was sharpened like a blade. When the chamber finally quieted, he spoke in a slow southern drawl that made every word land like a hammer. Dr. Biden, he began, I'll give you this, you know how to give a speech. You've got passion, you've got the delivery. But here's the problem, passion without results is just noise. And America's had enough noise from this administration. He paused, glancing at the reporters, then back at Jill, his voice cutting deeper with each sentence. You say you stand by real people. You say you've been in classrooms, sat with grieving families, listened to victims. Fine. But tell me this, what has actually changed? Because from where I'm sitting, crime is up, inflation is choking working families, our borders look like a welcome mat, and kids in those very classrooms you talk about are still failing. That's not leadership. That's failure wrapped in sympathy. The chamber erupted, but Kennedy didn't wait. He pressed forward, his voice rising. You defend your husband as a man who acts quietly. Well, let me remind you, quiet leadership is fine in a classroom, but when you're President of the United States, quiet means weak. Quiet means enemies abroad laugh at us. Quiet means cartels and criminals pour across the border. Quiet means American families whisper at their dinner tables about whether they'll make rent this month. Quiet is killing this country, Dr. Biden. He leaned in closer, his voice now almost thunder. And as for me being an actor? Honey, I'd rather play the part of a fighter in this chamber than play the part of a ghost in the White House. At least when I speak, the American people know I'm standing up for them, not hiding behind platitudes and photo ops. Gasps filled the air. Some Democrats shouted in outrage. Others sat frozen, their eyes darting between Kennedy and Jill. The First Lady held her ground, her jaw tight, but the weight of Kennedy's words hung heavy over the chamber. Kennedy delivered his closing line with deliberate calm, almost like a preacher giving his final sermon. America doesn't need sympathy tours or empty words. It needs grit. It needs results. And it damn sure needs a president who leads with strength, not a First Lady who comes in here trying to do the job for him. The chamber exploded, cheers from one side, furious shouts from the other. Reporters nearly leapt over each other to capture the moment. In a single exchange, Kennedy had flipped the spotlight, leaving Jill Biden standing not as the defender of her husband, but as the symbol of an administration Kennedy had just painted as weak and failing. It was more than a political clash, it was a collision of worldviews. One side fueled by emotion and empathy, the other by blunt, unapologetic force. And the crowd knew, this battle wasn't ending today. It was only the beginning.